Imagine a single spotlight cutting through the darkness of Carnegie Hall. The year is 1961. 3,000 people are already on their feet before Judy Garland even opens her mouth. When she finally sings, grown men weep openly. The New York Times calls it the greatest one-woman performance in American entertainment history. She is not just a singer. She's the living soul of an entire era. But 8 years later, a man pushes open a bathroom door in a rented London flat and finds her sitting on the toilet, cold and still, gone from this world forever. She is 47 years old. The woman who generated over $100 million for MGM leaves behind an estate worth exactly $40,000. No grand farewell, no crowd calling her back. What happened between that spotlight and that silence? But before we dive into the darkness behind that spotlight, I want to stop for just a moment and talk to you directly. Where are you watching this from right now? Are you curled up on your couch, maybe with a warm cup of coffee in your hands? Perhaps it is late at night and the house is finally quiet. Wherever you are, I want you to get comfortable, because what we are about to uncover together is not a simple rise and fall story. This is something far more raw, far more human than that. You already know Judy Garland. Maybe you grew up watching her click those ruby slippers together. Maybe Over the Rainbow was the first song that ever made you feel something you could not name. That connection you feel toward her, that warmth, that ache, it is not an accident. It is the truest thing about her. So, settle in, because the real story of Judy Garland, the one Hollywood never wanted you to know, starts long before the yellow brick road. Picture a little girl, 2.5 years old, being carried out onto a stage in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, on a cold December night in 1924. The audience laughs and claps at the tiny creature standing under the lights. She opens her mouth and sings, and something extraordinary happens. The room goes quiet in that particular way. Rooms only go quiet when they encounter something they cannot explain. That little girl's name was Frances Ethel Gumm, and from that night forward, she would spend the rest of her life chasing the feeling of being wanted that only a stage could give her. But the story of Judy Garland does not begin on that stage. It began before she was even born. When Ethel Gumm discovered she was pregnant for the third time, there was no celebration in the Gumm household. Frank Gumm, her husband, quietly reached out to a friend with medical knowledge asking how to end the pregnancy. Abortion was illegal in America in the 1920s, so Frances came into this world not as a gift, but as a problem that could not be solved. She was the child nobody wanted. And somehow, deep in the way that children always know things adults never say out loud, she felt that truth every single day of her childhood. Frank Gumm was a charming man on the surface. He ran the local movie theater, played piano, and made people laugh. But behind closed doors, Frank harbored a secret that would repeatedly destroy the family's stability. He was attracted to men, specifically to the young male ushers and students who passed through his theater. When the rumors became too loud to ignore, the Gumm family packed up and fled town. This happened not once, but multiple times. There were stretches where the family had no permanent home at all, living out of their automobile on the roads of California. For young Frances, the word home never meant safety. It meant the next place they were running to. Her mother, Ethel, was a different kind of wound entirely. A frustrated vaudevillian who never achieved the stardom she craved, Ethel transferred every ounce of her ambition onto her daughters, and most intensely, onto Frances. When Frances was just 10 years old, Ethel began giving her amphetamines before performances to keep her energy sharp and bright under the lights. Then came the sleeping pills at night to bring her back down again. Up in the morning, down at night. A 10-year-old child cycling through drugs on a schedule her mother controlled. This was not negligence. This was a system. In 1935, everything changed at once. Frances, now 13, auditioned for Louis B. Mayer at MGM. He signed her on the spot without even requiring a screen test, an almost unheard-of event in Hollywood history. Her mother wept with joy. Frances stood there holding the contract, perhaps believing that this was the moment the pain would stop. Then, just months later, her father, Frank, died of meningitis. He was gone before Frances could fully understand what she had lost. Frank had been many things: a flawed man, a complicated secret, a source of shame. But he had also been the one person in her life who looked at her with something close to unconditional warmth. With him gone, the last soft place in her world disappeared. She later recalled that her mother remarried on the 4th anniversary of Frank's death to a man Frances despised. No one asked how she felt. No one ever did. Years later, when asked about her childhood, Judy Garland said something that stopped every interviewer cold. She said the only time she ever felt truly wanted as a child was when she was standing on a stage, performing. Not at home, not at school, not in her mother's arms, only on a stage, under lights, surrounded by strangers. And that stage, the only place she ever felt safe, was about to become the very thing that destroyed her. Louis B. Mayer liked to think of himself as a father figure. He spoke about his stars the way a farmer speaks about his livestock, with pride, with ownership, and with absolutely no concern for what the animal might be feeling inside. When 13-year-old Frances Gumm walked into his office and opened her mouth to sing, Mayer did not see a child. He saw an asset. He signed her without a screen test, renamed her Judy Garland after a popular song and a film critic, and immediately began the process of reshaping her into whatever MGM needed her to be. What MGM needed, it turned out, was a girl who looked perpetually young, perpetually wholesome, and perpetually available for whatever role the studio assigned. Judy had curves developing naturally on her teenage body, and the studio found that unacceptable. They bound her chest with tape to flatten her figure. They fitted her into a painfully tight corset for her Wizard of Oz costumes. They assigned her a strict daily diet of black coffee and chicken soup, and when she tried to order a normal meal at the studio commissary, staff would physically take the plate away from her hands. She was also encouraged to smoke up to 80 cigarettes a day as a method of appetite suppression. She was 16 years old. To keep her performing at the pace MGM demanded, the studio introduced a solution they considered entirely reasonable. Amphetamines in the morning to wake her up and keep her sharp under the lights. Sleeping pills at night to shut her body down so she could start again tomorrow. Judy had already been on this same cycle since she was 10, courtesy of her mother. MGM simply industrialized it. To make the arrangement even more efficient, the studio sent her to 6 different doctors simultaneously, each prescribing medication without knowing about the other 5. It was not carelessness. It was a deliberate system designed to keep one young girl producing at maximum capacity, while ensuring no single doctor ever saw the full picture. Then came The Wizard of Oz in 1939. Judy was 17. The film was a production of staggering scale, and MGM treated it accordingly, which meant the pressure on their young star was immense. On the surface, she was Dorothy, the sweet girl from Kansas who believed in goodness and magic and the power of home. Behind the camera, she was a teenager running on stimulants, barely eating, wearing a costume that physically hurt her, trying to hit her marks while grown men on set felt entitled to put their hands where they did not belong. The actors playing the Munchkins, according to Sidney Luft's later memoir, made Judy's life on set a daily misery in ways that no teenager should ever have to endure. Despite all of this, or perhaps because of the extraordinary human being she was underneath all the damage, Judy delivered a performance that stopped the world. Over the Rainbow became more than a song. It became a kind of prayer that an entire generation carried inside them. In 1940, the Academy of Motion Pictures gave her a special miniature Oscar for outstanding performance by a screen juvenile. She was 18 years old, holding a golden trophy, and she could not sleep at night without pharmaceutical assistance. The partnership with Mickey Rooney throughout the late 1930 and early 1940 generated extraordinary box office returns, with their films consistently placing in the top 10 nationally. MGM was making an enormous fortune. Judy was making headlines, and every single morning she woke up and swallowed the pills that kept the whole machine running. By the mid-1940s, Judy Garland was one of the biggest stars in the world. Meet Me in St. Louis in 1944 introduced her to a new audience and a new director, a sophisticated man named Vincente Minnelli, who saw something in her beyond the girl-next-door image MGM had built around her. For the first time in her professional life, someone with power was telling her she was more than the studio said she was. She fell in love with that feeling, as much as she fell in love with the man himself. But the pills were still there every morning, and the cracks were already spreading beneath the surface of everything that looked golden. In June of 1945, Judy Garland married Vincente Minnelli in a ceremony that Hollywood treated as the wedding of the decade. He was 32 years older than her in spirit, if not entirely in years, a refined and visually brilliant director who had already proven himself one of the most sophisticated craftsmen in the MGM stable. For Judy, marrying Vincente felt like finally stepping into a life that matched the grandeur of what she projected on screen. For the first time, she was not just a product. She was a wife. She was a woman. In March of 1946, their daughter Liza was born. People who were present in those early weeks described Judy as transformed. The anxiety that usually lived behind her eyes went quiet. She held that baby with a tenderness that seemed to come from somewhere beyond performance, somewhere entirely real and unguarded. Liza Minnelli would later say that her mother loved with a ferocity that was almost frightening. In those first months of motherhood, Judy Garland was, by all accounts, genuinely happy. But MGM did not slow down for happiness. The studio's answer to everything, including a new mother recovering from childbirth, was the same answer it had always been. More pills, more scheduling, more films, more appearances. Judy was placed back on her pharmaceutical routine almost immediately, and the workload that followed was punishing by any standard. She was making multiple films per year, recording music, doing promotional appearances, and trying to hold together a marriage to a man whose own private life was becoming increasingly complicated. Whispers had followed Vincente Minnelli throughout his career. Quiet suggestions that his attractions did not align entirely with the heterosexual image Hollywood required of its leading men. Whether those whispers were true in full, or only in part, Judy began to sense that the intimacy she craved from her marriage was not something Vincente was entirely capable of giving her. The loneliness that had defined her childhood began seeping back in through the walls of their beautiful home. By the late 1940s, the pills were no longer just a studio imposition. They had become the architecture of her daily existence. Without the amphetamines, she could not face the morning. Without the sleeping pills, she could not survive the night. The dependency that MGM had engineered when she was a teenager had matured into something the studio now turned against her. When she began arriving late to sets, or missing days entirely, the official narrative became that Judy Garland was difficult, unstable, and unreliable. No one in any position of power stood up and said what was plainly true, which was that the studio itself had built the machine that was now tearing her apart. Director Charles Waters called her the ugly duckling of the industry. Louis B. Mayer, the man who had signed her at 13, still called her his little hunchback. These were not private remarks. They were said in front of colleagues, in front of crew members, in front of people who would repeat them. Judy absorbed every word. A woman who had spent her entire life being told her body was wrong, her appetite was wrong, her existence was an inconvenience, had no defenses left against that kind of cruelty. In 1950, MGM made it official. After 15 years of service, after generating more than $100 million for the studio, Judy Garland was fired. The letter was clinical and cold. There was no gratitude. There was no acknowledgement of what she'd given them. She was simply no longer useful in the way they needed, and so she was discarded. The breakdown that followed was severe. Judy attempted to take her own life more than once during this period. Sid Luft, the man who would become her third husband, described walking into a room and finding her with slashed wrists, blood soaking through the white lace of her nightgown, her arms extended toward him as though she was offering him the evidence of her pain. He got her to a hospital. Then he got her back on her feet. And then he did something nobody in Hollywood had done for Judy Garland in a very long time. He told her she was still extraordinary. He told her the world still needed to hear her sing. That belief, fragile and borrowed as it was, became the foundation of the most stunning comeback in Hollywood history. But even as she climbed back toward the light, the darkness had not finished with her yet. In 1951, Judy Garland walked out onto the stage of the London Palladium and did something nobody in Hollywood believed she was still capable of doing. She brought an entire theater to its feet. The British audience, who had no obligation to be forgiving, gave her a standing ovation that lasted so long the stagehands lost count. She followed that triumph with an engagement at New York's Palace Theater that broke every existing box office record the venue had ever seen. The New York Times called it one of the greatest personal triumphs in the history of show business. She was awarded a special Tony Award for her contribution to the revival of vaudeville. Hollywood had thrown her away. The world had caught her. Sid Luft had made all of it possible. As her manager and her third husband, he had engineered her return to the stage with a shrewdness that matched his genuine belief in her talent. He had also pushed forward the project that would become her most artistically ambitious work. A Star is Born, released in 1954, was not simply a film. It was a confession. Judy played Esther Blodgett, a woman of extraordinary talent who watches her own life slowly consumed by the needs and failures of the man she loves. Every critic who saw the original cut understood immediately that the distance between the character and the actress playing her was essentially zero. The film was initially budgeted at $3 million. By the time production finished, it had cost $6 million, making it the most expensive film ever produced in Hollywood at that point. Judy's chemical dependencies, her weight fluctuations, her absences from set had all contributed to the overruns. But those who worked closely with her during production told a more complicated story. When she was present and focused, she was, in the words of one production colleague, lightning fast. One rehearsal and she was ready. One reading and her lines were committed to memory. Her photographic memory was extraordinary. The woman the studio called unreliable was also the woman delivering what many would later consider the greatest female performance in the history of Hollywood musicals. The Academy agreed, at least in part. Judy received a nomination for Best Actress. NBC was so certain she would win that the network sent a film crew directly to her hospital room, where she was recovering from the birth of her son, Joey, ready to broadcast her acceptance speech live to the nation. The camera was set up, the lights were adjusted, and then Grace Kelly's name was read from the envelope instead. Groucho Marx sent Judy a telegram that same night. It read simply that this was the biggest robbery since Brinks, a reference to the largest armed heist in American history at the time. The entire industry seemed to agree. But the Oscar went to Grace Kelly, and Judy went home to her hospital bed, and Warner Brothers proceeded to cut 27 minutes from A Star is Born without her consent, effectively destroying the structural integrity of the film she had poured everything into. That decision, brutal and careless, marked the end of Judy Garland as a major Hollywood film star. The years that followed were a long, slow unraveling. Her marriage to Sid Luft, the longest of her 5, began collapsing under the weight of her addiction and his own complicated failings. By 1962, they were living virtually separate lives under the same roof. Their children, Lorna and Joey, grew up in a household where their mother's presence was unpredictable. Warm and luminous one moment, chemically distant the next. Luft would later write that the children often could not tell when their mother was medicated. That sentence alone contains more heartbreak than most people encounter in a lifetime. The Judy Garland Show in 1963 offered a brief moment of professional hope. Critics praised it as some of the finest television being produced in America. But CBS scheduled it directly opposite Bonanza on NBC, and the ratings never recovered. After 26 episodes, the network canceled it. Another door closed. She married Mark Herron in 1965, a relationship that lasted 5 months before collapsing into allegations of physical abuse. Then came Mickey Demise, a musician who had first appeared in her life delivering a package of stimulant tablets to her hotel room. He introduced himself to her children as a doctor. He was not a doctor. He was, however, the man she chose to marry in London in March of 1969, 3 months before her death. Her daughter Lorna, watching her mother in those final months, said something quietly devastating in her memoir. She said she could see her mother dying right in front of Mickey Demise, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. In the winter of 1968, Judy Garland arrived in London for a series of performances at a supper club called Talk of the Town. She was 46 years old. The woman who had filled Carnegie Hall with 3,000 people standing on their feet was now booked into a venue where the audience ate dinner while she performed. The bookings were not a choice born of artistic preference. They were a financial necessity. The money was gone. The film offers were gone. The television show was gone. What remained was the voice. And even that was beginning to show the damage of decades of pharmaceutical abuse and relentless stress. The shows were erratic. Some nights she arrived late, sometimes by an hour or more, leaving audiences sitting in silence over their cooling meals. Other nights she forgot lyrics to songs she had been singing for 30 years. There were evenings when she stood at the microphone and seemed genuinely lost, not in the dramatic way of a performer milking emotion, but in the frightening way of a person who no longer knows exactly where they are. The London press was not kind. One newspaper published a photograph of her that accompanied a caption suggesting she looked less like a Hollywood legend and more like a cleaning woman who had wandered in from the street. She had always been insecure about her appearance. MGM had ensured that. From the time she was 13, a parade of studio executives, directors, and so-called colleagues had told her in various ways that her body was wrong. Her face was insufficient. Her value was entirely dependent on what she could produce for other people. That cruelty had never left her. It had simply accumulated layer upon layer until it became the voice she heard every time she looked in a mirror. By early 1969, those closest to her could see what Lorna Luft had already articulated in private. Judy was not living, she was enduring. Mickey Demise, her fifth husband, was 29 years younger in spirit than the situation required of him. He had married a legend and found himself living with a woman in serious medical decline, dependent on barbiturates in quantities that no human body could sustain indefinitely. He tried, in his limited way, to manage the medication. But managing Judy Garland's relationship with prescription drugs at that stage was like trying to redirect a river with your bare hands. On the night of June 21st, 1969, Judy and Mickey had a quiet evening together in their rented cottage in Chelsea. There was nothing dramatic about it. No final argument, no tearful confession, no moment that anyone present recognized as a last goodbye. They were simply two people at the end of an ordinary day. Judy went to the bathroom sometime in the night. Mickey fell asleep. When he woke and found the bathroom door locked, he climbed over the roof of an adjacent room and looked through the window. Judy was seated on the toilet, her chin resting on her chest, completely still. The coroner's report confirmed death by an accidental overdose of barbiturates. The accumulated dose was described as incautious self-overdosage. There was no suicide. No, there was no dramatic final gesture. There was only the quiet, terrible arithmetic of a body that had simply run out of the capacity to absorb any more of what had been fed into it since she was 10 years old. She was 47 years old. The little girl who had been carried onto a stage in Grand Rapids to sing Jingle Bells for a crowd of strangers was gone. Her daughter, Liza Minnelli, who had once laughed and told her mother she would come to her next wedding instead of her fifth, paid for the funeral. James Mason, her co-star from A Star is Born, stood at the podium and delivered a eulogy of extraordinary grace. He said that Judy's great gift was that she could pull tears from hearts of rock, and that she had given so richly and so generously that there was no currency in which the world could ever repay her. Outside the church, history was making one of its stranger and more poignant coincidences. The Stonewall riots, the uprising that would launch the modern LGBTQ rights movement, were erupting on the streets of New York in those same days. The community that had claimed Judy Garland as one of their own, that had seen in her survival and her suffering a mirror of their own, was rising up in her name without even fully knowing it. Her remains were eventually transferred, at her children's request, to Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles in 2017. She came home at last, 48 years too late, but she came home. Over the Rainbow has always been a song about longing for a place where the pain stops. Judy Garland sang it for the first time at 17, not yet knowing how completely her own life would come to embody every word of it. She spent 47 years searching for that place somewhere over the rainbow. She never found it here. There is a version of Judy Garland's story that Hollywood prefers you to remember. The little girl in the blue dress? The ruby slippers, the yellow brick road. That version is clean and beautiful and safe. It asks nothing difficult of anyone. It places all the magic on the screen and leaves all the wreckage neatly off stage where no one has to look at it. But the true story of Judy Garland asks something harder of us. It asks us to look directly at what was done to her and to name it clearly. The child was handed pills by her own mother before she was old enough to understand what pills were. A teenager was bound and starved and harassed by the most powerful studio in Hollywood, while the world applauded the results. A woman spent 3 decades trying to outrun a dependency that other people had built inside her body before she ever had the chance to choose differently. None of that happened in secret. All of it happened in plain sight, and the people who could have stopped it chose instead to keep buying tickets. Talent is not armor. That is perhaps the most important thing Judy Garland's life teaches us. We tend to believe in the way that comfortable myths encourage us to believe. That extraordinary ability carries with it some form of protection. That genius is rewarded, that the brightest lights are somehow safer than the rest of us. Judy Garland was living proof that the opposite can be true. Her gift was precisely what made her so useful to the people who exploited her, and so vulnerable to the system that consumed her. But here is the other truth, the one that lives on the other side of all that darkness. 3 children carried her love into the world and built lives of their own. Liza Minnelli became one of the most celebrated performers of her generation. Millions of people who felt invisible in their own lives heard Over the Rainbow and felt, for the length of one song, that someone understood exactly what it meant to long for something better. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. Judy Garland did not get the life she deserved, but she gave the world something it has never been able to let go of, and that is its own kind of immortality. So I want to ask you something before you go. When you think about what happened to Judy Garland, who do you hold responsible? Was it the mother who saw a meal ticket instead of a daughter? Was it the studio that built a machine out of a child and called it entertainment? Or was it something larger? A system that has always been perfectly willing to destroy the people it claims to celebrate. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you have a memory of the first time Over the Rainbow moved you, I want to hear that too. Those moments matter. She would have wanted to know about them. If stories like this one speak to you, the kind that go behind the curtain and tell the truth about the golden age that was never quite as golden as it looked, then subscribe to this channel. There are more of these stories waiting to be told, and every single one of them deserves to be heard.